The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer claimed that each human face is a hieroglyph which truly can be deciphered, indeed whose alphabet we bear within us ready-made. A human being's face even says more and is more interesting as a rule than his mouth, for it is the compendium of everything they will ever say, being the monogram of all this human being's thinking and striving. This method, according to which the interior expresses itself in the exterior, is known as physiognomics and is the subject of a project conducted at Foscari University of Venice entitled Physiognomonica, Physiognomics as Philosophy, Reconceiving an Early Modern Science. This project is led by myself, Cecilia Muratori, and is made possible by funding from the European Union, the Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under the Marie Curie Individual Fellowship Scheme. And today I have the great pleasure and honour to talk to Daniel Rees, who is Engagement Officer at the Wellcome Library in London. The Wellcome Library owns one of the the largest and most interesting and varied collections of physiognomic manuscripts and printed books and also objects. So I'm delighted that Daniel will talk to us today a bit about all these various aspects of physiognomics. And indeed, physiognomics can mean different things. And it also had a very varied and also troubled trajectory. So I'd like to ask you to begin with what kind of, you have a long-standing interest in physiognomics. Daniel also curated an exhibition on physiognomics here at the library. What image of physiognomics do we get if we look at some of the materials, and what are your favorite materials here that show, you think, this trajectory?
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure to talk about such an interesting topic that I think I did appreciate that the Wellcome Collection and the Wellcome Library have a very unique and quite rare amount of material on subjects that are not that well known, or maybe don't fit into a lot of ordinary disciplines. And I think the thing that really intrigued me was there is this thing called physiognomy. There is these ideas about character and faces, and I don't know about you, but I often, when I look around the train or I look at people on the street, and I start to wonder what they're like and how am I judging that? And what the central question for me when I first tried to put on a little exhibition was, is there a rationale? Is there a science behind this? Is there any, what are they saying is the reason that they have drawn these conclusions? So I find that by asking that question, it kind of led me down a particular path, and I quickly realised that there was no system, there was no single idea, that it came from so many different angles and backgrounds and influences that, but it still made it really interesting, despite the fact that you couldn't say this person believed this and they proved it by this, I mean, when you're talking about character, psychology, suddenly so many things come into play. And I think that's what's interesting about when you trace the history of physiognomy, for example here, you do appreciate that it is a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, we're looking at material today mainly from Europe, but as I'm sure you're aware, that Chinese and Indian have a very long history of face reading and types. And I think that's one of the great pleasures of working here, is that you do get to see material from very different cultures.
And the Wellcome Library has a particular focus on medicine. So there is also the medical side of physiognomy, where it's a technique that can be used for diagnosis, right? For medical diagnosis.
Yes, and interestingly, what that also plays into, I suppose, history as well, because we have some diagnostic books here, so they are to teach doctors how to diagnose, but there does seep into it ideas about physiognomy as well, and this is going into the 20th century really. Ideas about temperament, very old ideas about, you know, choleric and sanguine temperaments, but it's translated into a slightly different vein, but you can see the tenets, the beliefs are still there, you know, that there are such things as malingerers, people who are trying to sort of pretend that they're ill, and doctors some of them have a bit of a suspicion of those that claim one thing, but they look at them. I mean, one example that I've spoken about in the past is how there's a recommendation from a doctor that the patient should sit with a strong light on them, so you can look at their expression closely, but that you should be sitting more in the shadow so they can't recognise in your face any kind of alarm or concern. So it's interesting, there's a kind of two-way communication there that the doctor's very much aware of. And again, they start to think about particular illnesses having particular expressions, shall we say, on the face. But again, this is all anecdotal, it's all from, you know, experience, but this is simply theory.
And there are some lines that clearly develop from antiquity through early modernity, but changing shape and reaching really the contemporary world, as you say. So the idea of that physiognomics is useful. So it has applications. It's not just a theoretical science. Well, we'll talk about whether it's a science, whether we can define it as a science, but it's useful in many ways because it allows us to decide whether the person we are talking to is trustworthy or not, for instance, but also for diagnosing diseases, for instance. So there is a crossover there of physiognomic terminology reaches modernity and the contemporary world, really.
Yes, and I mean, for example, so I mean, you can't trust what I say because my eyebrows meet in the middle. You see, so it's, I mean, yes, talking about things like, you know, masculine inverted commas and feminine faces, and the traits that we expect to see maybe in typical male face, but there's extremes and variety. So extremely male faces can be seen as quite slightly untrustworthy because they are expected to be a very dominant alpha male personality. So much comes into play, but it's often based in biological differences, should we say, loosely speaking.
And aesthetics is another important branch that feeds into physiognomics, right? So there is a lot of visual materials, and we'll see some examples in the moment. So usually manuscripts and physiognomic books are illustrated, so there is also that aspect of it's a very creative approach.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have so many varieties of artwork here, you know, from the simple kind of woodcut to quite sophisticated engravings, larger scale pictures, often, sometimes from a sort of a satirical view as well, some poking fun at, because physiognomy has had a lot of its critics and people, you know, rubbishing it and saying it's not a pseudoscience, it's just complete nonsense.
Yeah, well, let's follow this interesting point a bit more. So perhaps you could tell us something about this book you have in front of you, which really points to this, boundary, if there is a boundary between science. Sometimes it's blurred in physiognomics. Whether we're talking about divination, magic, what can be defined as a science, and that changed over time.
Yeah, so luckily this particular person, Richard Saunders, really does sit right between. He is described in the frontispiece as an astrologer and studier of physics, so he's both a doctor and an astrologer. And I've made it the point in the past that would you go to your current doctor and your current doctor gives you a horoscope as well, as your medical condition, so we probably would be a bit funny about being wondering what they were doing. But this is 1672 and it was perfectly acceptable for this work to be published, and I suppose being a doctor lends credulity to astrology, and astrology is also, as we know in past ideas about medicine, very influential on the body, certainly thought to be very influential. So this sits amongst works on, for example, palmistry and dream interpretation as well. So it's a physiognomy is part of that area of divination, of trying to sort of fortune tell. But we can see, obviously, the heavy influence of Aristotelian thinking about both astrology is mentioned, but also animals. So in this one, for example, we talk about Venus at the root of the nose. So you've already got characteristics of these gods and goddesses like love and or Mars being a feisty character, a warlike character. So it's combining that, but also again ideas about things like relative sizes. So the broad forehead represents a person gluttonous and unclean. The small forehead is referring to things like rats, so it's a kind of mean thing. So you're getting this idea that size is actually very important, that size matters, and that I've seen this in earlier manuscripts as well about the physical body, that the large aspects of features or physique of physique of the human frame is considered extreme in one sense. But the smaller the nose, smaller the person, they are somehow deficient in aspects of character. And you find that the average
is the trustworthy, physiognomic, and you're right. It's interesting to note this the continuity with which certain philosophical sources are adapted. So you mentioned Aristotle. So there's the pseudo-Aristotelian Physiognomonica, which gives the title to my project. Indeed, it makes use of this comparison with animals, for instance. But Aristotle even talks about palmistry, really, in works that are not spurious. So there are indeed Aristotelian roots, and Aristotle came to be the scientist among philosophers. So mentioning Aristotle is also a way of giving authority to the discipline. So just to say, it's rooted in Aristotelian materials. So this is a proper science.
And picking up on that, so this is why I like to try and look at the long term of it, because there is a point at which, like you say, science becomes something more than learning from the great, the classical scholars, which lasted a very long time. So people would reference Galen and Aristotle to give themselves, the shared kudos and authority. But then when these, Galen, for example, would start to be challenged during that kind of Renaissance and Enlightenment period, and people did their own experimentation and realised that actually there were some things that were slightly wrong. Was that actually a human or was that a pig? Then we see more of a demand for proof, I think, and that again doesn't prevent physiognomy from kind of continuing, but it becomes something else, and technology then starts to have a say in again. But doesn't prove it, but kind of again lends a new take on proving or bolstering older ideas that we've kind of held on to.
Yeah, I really like when you say, so it became something else very slowly, but it became something different. And we have also various examples here of the directions in which he developed. Well, for instance, we could mention this, which are letters by Cesare Lombroso, asking other colleagues to send him data about patients, especially in this letter that we have here about patients suffering from epilepsy, and he's asking to his colleagues to give him details about details such as whether the epileptics are left-handed or right-handed, how big they are, how much they weigh, and whether they have the typology of the criminal. So physiognomics also becomes then entangled with criminology.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the areas I find most interesting, because it ceases to, what it does then is it posits individuality in a kind of medical sphere, but that criminality is almost like an inherited defect. It is not a socio-cultural problem. It is not a problem of economics and circumstances. No, it's a problem of the individual has these tendencies that they can't help. So Lombroso particularly, I think, is such an interesting figure because he became very much discredited later, but at the time very influential. I mean, he's mentioned in Dracula. So in Bram Stoker's Dracula, they talk about the Count Dracula being this is typical. Lombroso would say, this sort of strange look is very criminal. There's almost like an obsession with crime as a problem, that if only we can recognise it, then we can help control it. And it ties in with that whole idea about identity and surveillance and knowing who people are, so we can look out for people like that. Because if they're like that, then other people that look like that must be similar. Which Lombroso's kind of trying to put that idea across. I mean, he was a professor, so he was held in high regard, and there's still a statue to him in Italy as well.
Well, you really touching on the issue of determinism. This is really what determinism has really accompanied the history of physiognomics from the very beginning. So, the signs that we see on the body, do they necessitate a certain features of the soul, or is the connection more or less loose? This also has to do with whether we are talking about mobile signs or fixed signs in the body, for instance, and whether one could use physiognomics also to diagnose oneself and to overcome the defects, which doesn't seem to be the case in instances of criminality in this sense. So if you have the features of the criminal on your face, then there is almost a necessity that you will become a criminal at some point.
Yes, and I think Lombroso's point was that you can't help yourself. You cannot change. It's within you. It's predetermined. So basically, I think he was quite a strong proponent of throwing away the key, because when you let them out, they're just going to do the same thing, because they're this atavistic throwback to a different, an early version, if you like, where we don't have the same sophistication and control that we kind of want to see ourselves as having. But isn't that a difference between him and, say, Lavater, who it's all about self-improvement, isn't it? It's all about for the benefit of humankind to improve yourself morally, see it in others, but so that you can become a better person.
Yeah, and in early modernity, for certain, there is the aspect of improving oneself, and using physiognomics as a tool for improving society is very strong. So we also find deterministic aspects, and we might talk about palmistry, for instance, in a moment, where which suggests that there are some features that you're born with. But the idea of being able to use physiognomics to change yourself and the others is indeed very strong. So it's an ethical discipline. So very much against the idea of throwing away the key. Would you perhaps like us to tell us what that is?
Yes. So this is just what I happen to have myself, but we have obviously many images and related material in the collection, particularly actual human skulls that have phrenological delineations put on them. But this is typical of the things that we again. There's the astrological references in palmistry. I did a talk here, and I wanted to speak about the history of palm reading to our audience who were coming in. And of course, I tried to start by saying this is what history teaches us, that this is what people have said about the heart line, for example, and how that relates to your romantic side or whatever. And I was trying to do it in a dispassionate way, but the minute I started, everybody was just like, read my fortune. What does that mean? And they just wanted to sort of really to have themselves kind of talked about in this way. But I suppose it is just as old, isn't it, as physiognomy, in terms of the body itself as being something that's legible, that can be read. I mean, what I find interesting as well is that this, for example, phrenology and palmistry, there are accepted and widespread schema and plans that are the same. So wherever you go, this is the line of Mercury, that's your life line. These are the accepted lines and what they stand for. And phrenology has, I think, quite a narrow definition, and you see it repeated and repeated. Yeah. But physiognomy, there's very little apart from Aristotle and the idea of animal traits being human traits as well, there's still to be so much variation and change, and aspects changing and emphasis being rising and falling, really. That's what I find both interesting but also slightly frustrating. That there's so many versions of what it means.
In my early modern sources, what I see is that there is a huge debate going on about whether palmistry and metoposcopies, the reading of the forehead, are simply branches of physiognomics or not. So in some versions, in some interpretations, they are simply the physiognomic procedure applied to a certain part of the body, and in a sense of physiognomics comes to the rescue of palmistry and metoposcopy. And in other cases, especially when it becomes a suspicious discipline, so towards the end of the 16th century, palmistry and metoposcopy are the sides of the art, so to speak, thrown away. So that's where we find the divinatory, religiously ambiguous stuff. But physiognomy, on the other hand, is perfectly acceptable. It's rooted in, indeed, Galen and Hippocrates and Aristotle. So if we just push aside palmistry and metoposcopy, then physiognomy can still be rescued. So there are these two approaches that are competing.
Yes, that's so true, isn't it? Yes, it has the ability to shift and change as time sort of progresses, I think. But it's still that fundamental, I think, need for us to feel that we can recognise something in other people that gives us some kind of advantage, I suppose, because essentially, I suppose, one of the things when you meet somebody as a fellow human being, are they a threat to you? You have to fairly quick. I mean, we live in a very civilizing, often intense societies where there's so many people that we don't know around us that there's an almost like a inbuilt system where you just want to fairly quickly ascertain if that person is going to be physically going to hurt you or whether they're not a threat. So there's certain keys, I think, that we've learnt, but also we've kind of gone into a lot of fiction and prejudice and ideas as well.
And perhaps you could show us some of the more modern things about, you mentioned phrenology, for instance, and the use of photography also for physiognomics. Oh, fantastic. What are these?
So we have here some reproductions, but we do have an original version, which is quite fragile, so I didn't get it out today. But this is where we have technology coming together with ideas about expression and character. So this is from this is French, and this is Duchenne. Known originally as Duchenne de Boulogne because there was another doctor called Duchenne in Paris, but ironically that doctor in Paris we don't know about now, and Duchenne is the one who's become more famous. He's given his name to Duchenne muscular dystrophy, so some people may have heard of him from that. So we can see he is a doctor first and foremost, but his contribution was to look at galvanism, as it was described then, or it's electricity basically. So he's applying electrodes, sounds a bit painful, applying electrodes to the face, causing the muscles to contract, and then really looking at what effect this has. But he's a doctor, so he's interested in muscles and nerves, and that's his specialist area. But in this very, very early use of photography in a scientific dissertation, that's quite important. He thought photography was a convincing medium to help establish what he was saying was true. Darwin uses photography in on the expression of emotions in animals, and he uses, with permission, quite a large number of Duchenne's photographs. But Darwin also uses some wood engravings after the photographs, so he adapts them slightly. He's slightly more, I think he's slightly worried about his publishers are worried about too many photographs because it's very expensive to do. But this is where you get some interesting, again, mixtures of science and aesthetics. So this is Duchenne. Showing that one of his early patients, because this gentleman here has partial facial paralysis, so he can't feel the electrodes as much as someone with normal sensitivity. This is why he used him, because it is uncomfortable, and he was experimenting. So he started with quite a high voltage and then realised you could do it with less, so it was less painful. But this is Duchenne. He's in the frame here. He's actually showing what he does. In some of the other pictures, he crops himself out, so you just get the thing coming in. So he's already editing and cropping, and there's some interesting choices there.
So he's adding expression to somebody who wouldn't have expression, right? Or would have very little expression.
So he's playing with muscles. Yes, this is what I find the most interesting thing, because we see that as an expression.
Artificially an expression.
It's not what the person's feeling.
Yes.
But he's using that as the tool. He's breaking it down to work out what the individual muscle movement signifies to us. And interestingly, he doesn't really he doesn't analyse too much what an emotion is. He simply lists them, and he goes into quite some detail about simple emotions and complex emotions. But it's just like matter of fact. This is what emotions are, and so there's no sort of real discussion. fascinating. He goes into quite a lot of detail.
It makes me think about acting as well. So,
yes, and that's a lot of acting is drawn from, I think, Charles Le Brun's word uses templates for, poses and expressions. But this is what I love. So in the original, Duchenne has a section called the section scientifique and then the section esthétique. So in the second section, what he does is he kind of moves slightly away from the very objective definitions of muscles and what effect they have to slightly different interpretations. So for example, this is meant to be an expression of the contemptuous smile. Now, you can
it's historical, huh? It just shows the expressions are historical, so we wouldn't associate it with probably with a contemptuous smile now.
Right, and but the problem I think he has is this is quite a subtle a thing, a contempt. So can you think of anyone who might have, who might be known for being slightly duplicitous and untrustworthy? Well, I think to try and overemphasize the point, what he does is he picks a character from, I wouldn't recognize this. This is a Shakespearean play.
Right.
So this is actually a representation of Lady Macbeth.
Oh, okay.
So he's had to bring in this narrative work to help contextualize it. So she's wearing this costume, she's hair is styled, because she's kind of she's beckoning in the character, do come in, but they're going to kill him. So hence the sort of slight smile. But it's because there's bad things coming. So he's playing with a new material, new medium here by using props and the idea of character on top of the electricity and the photography. He taught himself how to take photographs by, I think it was Nadir's brother, Turnashon. So he really wanted to control
this classifying the various typologies of expression in this way.
He actually gets quite sophisticated and uses a masking technique over half the faces to see whether that has an effect, which I think, having just come out of a pandemic where a lot of us were wearing masks, it does have quite an influence on. I think that's one thing I realised, how expressive the mouth is. People often talk about the eyes being most expressive, and yet the mouth can be very telling.
Or we sort of go back to Schopenhauer, saying, well, in a sense, physiognomy says more than what comes out of the mouth. You should actually read the mouth itself, not the words that come out of the mouth.
This is sort of, we're starting to, photography is being used as a way to be objective, arguably. Now, Duchenne was fairly straightforward in his understanding of photography. I should say that what he's doing is they're not instantaneous, and sometimes he rejects photographs because they're not showing what he thinks correct expression is to match what he's talking about. So there's an element of poetic license, shall we say, that's maybe not too scientific. Now, this leads us on to such an interesting character, Francis Galton. Is it okay to just carry on from this?
Please do.
Because Duchenne's breaking it down, so we have an understanding of the muscle and how we interpret that. But something very different's going on here. So Francis Galton invents composite photography. So the plate is used and you re-expose, so you get different images overlaid on top of each other. Now, Galton had a number of theories, and some of which are very influential and have been sort of proved to be quite useful and very interesting and taken up scientifically. Some of which haven't, and some of which are just simply prejudicial and really. So here's a good example of something that is trying to use the camera objectively, and yet things happen that go into the world of aesthetics. So here Galton is trying to use composite photography, overlaying these different portraits to come up with this sort of archetype, this typical face that represents, in this case, tuberculosis, but he tried this with very different types. The Jewish face he wanted to show. So we can see that there are, despite the science, there are prejudices and personal biases involved. But this is, so this is a kind of more medical aspects. This is, TB was known as physis then. But, in trying to kind of overlay these individuals and come up with a sort of generic face, what he does incidentally is produce something where all the anomalies, all the differences are evened out. So you end up with what you might call as more of a bland face, a sort of representation of many faces, but incidentally it's considered perhaps more an attractive face in terms of symmetry and balance. And this is an idea that came from this experiment, that actually averageness and symmetry are good signs, shall we say. Whether that's a good indicator of character or just that people we like that in someone else. But I think I still think it's very tenuous, because none of these, to me, look representative of anything in particular, because they're so blurred out. There's such an average that you don't really get a sense of identity. You just get a sense of blurring, really. And also, I think it must be very difficult to have exactly the same exposure for each thing, so that everything is equal, because some of these you can see he's used, say, 100 people here, but maybe only 11 here, and you can see, well, it doesn't, it's something seems to come through from some perhaps more than others. I'm not sure.
It's interesting that already in the La Porta, for instance, we have the idea that the average, the symmetry is physiognomically speaking a good sign, so connected with virtues, while the extremes, so to a large head, or you were mentioning earlier, or too small eyes, so these are extremes that are connected with what deviances.
And I think perhaps it's Galton's strongest legacy, is this idea of the mean and the average being critical, to then look at variations from that norm, if you like.
You mentioned before the caricatures of physiognomics. You have another example to show us.
Yes, so this is by a British caricaturist or satirist called Thomas Rowlandson. And this is Franz Gall, so one of the originators of the phrenological fashion, shall we say, the craze for skulls. And this is, I think you can tell looking at it that it's quite, it represents the phrenologists as quite extreme in their features as well. So I suppose it's quite a good example of the variation from the norm. The people have lumps in unusual places. The noses are quite extreme. And he's obviously exaggerating here.
And the shelves on the left-hand side are interesting.
This is my favourite, because it's quite subtle. You have 3 shelves here. At the bottom we have a group where they put together the philosophers, the statesmen and the historians. And then the middle section is poets, dramatists, actors. And at the top we have lawyers, thieves and murderers. So lawyers put very much
gradation
amongst but none of them are particularly flattering, are they, for them? I mean, apart from perhaps the sort of Greek almost like style bust at the bottom. But one of the things that it strikes me about the idea of skulls and measuring crania is that this is something that is actually it's almost like part of material culture. Because if you're describing faces, and how do you capture that? How do you put that into words, or how do you illustrate it? Whereas a skull is a very fixed thing that is measurable, and you can probably more easily compare sizes and shapes. But it's just a thought, really. But it's one of those things, isn't it? In physiognomy, that there's like you were saying earlier, there's a distinction between the fixed like profiles that Lavater it was liked because they were fixed, and there's the kind of the mobile and expressive nature of physiognomy that perhaps leaves its marks, like in metaposcopy or arguably palmistry. The repeated expressions leave their lines.
And there is also potential for materialism here, isn't there? So in classical physiognomics, the body is the window of the soul. So you read the body in order to access the soul. But when you start just measuring the body, the idea that you have of the soul changes. So what kind of soul is it? A soul that expresses itself fully on the surface of a body. So when you start to touch the parts of the body in this way, you end up linking the soul very strongly to what is visible. So potentially also losing that idea of an immortal soul inhabiting the body. So it feels like this is going to that direction. And I mean, not digressing too much, but we have the nice thing about the work here in the library is that it does go into areas of philosophy. This is not strictly medical. This is very broadly about health and the human condition. So we have got some really nice works by Descartes, who looks at the seat of the soul, which he kind of thought might be in the pineal gland. Again, it's the material and the soul and the spiritual. It's a soul that you can touch.
Yes.
And I know that you also brought a book about aesthetics and fashion.
Yes, of course, yes. Shall we look at that?
Yes, lovely.
So
this is a nice example of what you were saying before, that physiognomics also feeds into different branches, including aesthetics and in this case fashion.
Yes. So this is a really interesting book. Yes, he is styled himself as JB, the Chirographer. And it's talking about transformations, and it mentions in the title plate ridiculous beauty, loathsome loveliness of most nations. So this is judging what other people I suppose think of as beautiful or desirable. So it's looking across a number of different cultures, and he talks about different features. But this is something that I only read recently, and I thought,
mouth fashions.
Mouth fashions. And it talks about a wide mouth being in fashion at court. So the royal body, the body politic is very influential on the other members of society. It talks about people in Florida have wide mouths, and I think in Persia. Not actually been there, but that's what I've heard. And in Turkey, the women are accounted most beautiful that have the widest mouths. You may be sure that they use art to have them so. So he's talking about cosmetics. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of the idea of your character. And I think I'm right in saying that I read Della Porta actually came up with a chemical
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you could
Yeah.
release into the air that would show if a woman was wearing a lot of makeup. And if she was, it would turn the chemicals in the makeup would actually turn her face really dark.
Right.
And I thought, wow, that wouldn't go down very well, would it?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
So this idea that there is a surface beauty that is enhanced, perhaps, but also mixed in with this idea about copying fashion and being fashionable, is the idea of a comparison with the mouth being a feature that you can compare from animals to human beings. And so he talks about how the teeth and teeth of carnivores like wolves and lions are one of the sort of ways we compare. But he goes on to say those physiognomists therefore are in an error, who from a large mouth, great, robust and thick teeth, teach us to pronounce of the fortitude of a man, as if this is something similar. But he goes on to say that beasts, as it were, have mouths to tear and to eat, but that is not what the purpose of a human being's mouth is. It's necessarily small, and it talks about speech being the important features. So they don't need large mouths. So he's saying that's wrong. They have different functions. Incidentally, there is another area of very obvious racism in these kind of comments, in that they talk about other cultures and other people having larger lips and equating that, because they're making an odd argument that the large lips mean they can't articulate, can't talk.
Right.
So I just thought, wow, how odd that is. Regardless of the fact that we all are human beings who are all equally able to communicate, that you made that distinction about the mouth looking different, but making a very judgmental call.
Thank you very much. And the talking about the face, maybe you can show us this next intriguing document where the face is really central.
Absolutely. So obviously to the trained physiognomer, or the person that is really knows what they're talking about, there's a lovely image here of the indiscretions of Lavater. So here's a lady, a very fashionable lady, young, and she's holding up covering over the rest of her body, which is naked. But of course you don't need to know, you don't have to see it to be able to know exactly what her body looks like, because you're able to interpret all these points on her face that relate to the rest
the rest of the body.
Although you see, this is where I find it really difficult to have any credulity, because it's like, well, what does that mean there? Why does that correspond to that part of the body? But this is something that has been around for a long time, and I'm thinking particularly in terms of our early zoological zodiac body, zodiac man. So we're relating, the heart to Leo. Or
So this is actually quite close to metaposcopy, from which is it's a different application of metaposcopy, which also really goes into the divination.
And being able to do things like read futures from a liver, for example, that's extracted from an animal. If it's there and we think we can read it, then we will read the signs.
Do you want to show us the metaposcopy device?
So this is this is the reproduction. from something that we purchased quite a few years ago now, but the curator didn't know what the word meant, actually. She came to me and said, "It's metaposcopy." And I said, "Oh, well, it's really interesting." So we bought, it's a pamphlet in a slipcase, basically. So it's a very cheaply produced item. And it's sort of cashing in on the popularity of Lavater and his sort of great works. But obviously
from Germany.
And at a fraction of the price. So this is Dr. Carl Ludwig Silbermann. We can't find a record of him. But this is from 1785, so, you know, sort of a decade after. But this is not really... this is a sort of popularised version, I would say, and there are probably quite a few departures from the original. But fascinatingly, it had contained, there's two of these forehead readers. This is the blue one for a woman, and there's a yellow one for a man.
What material is it originally?
It's originally just card.
Ah, right.
So it's just a hand-painted card.
Right. Yeah.
And this is, I think, ever so slightly larger than life.
Okay.
But it's you can kind of see the sort of paint just painted over. Printed, and you do need to cut out these little sections here. So it's a delightful little piece, and I couldn't find any other. There's one other library that had a copy, but they did not have these.
Right,
so I don't think there's many places you will find them. And basically, there are instructions. We had it translated, which is really interesting because there's a lot of context around it. But you raise your...
From German, right?
From the German.
We didn't mention, so Physiognomics has a great tradition in vernacular languages.
Yes.
So because of the popularization that you were saying, so there are sources like here, there welcome many sources in Latin, but also we start to see from early modernity up to these 18th century materials. We see a lot of languages mixing in.
And I think Lavater was one of those sort of very across Europe, wasn't he? He became a figure that was part of the sort of cultural elite. They were aware of him in very different languages, and he was translated, wasn't he? So nice that it sort of brings us together a bit rather than anything else. So this the practical applications are you raise your forehead, and then you would get a little pen, and you just write make a nice mark on your forehead, and then you lay this over the top. And where the mark appears, you see it's got delineations of lines. Now, where it appears, so if it sort of comes up there, 4 to 5, you would use the little legend, and you'd find your line is actually to do with astrology. So if it was, say, for example, on the line of Venus, and you'd say, "Oh, you love tall men." And you also like stitching. So you can see it's not exactly really too revealing about character, but it does talk about both personality traits, but also there are predictions within that as well. So some of it is not so nice. Some of it's fun, but some is a little bit darker, like "We'll die in a fire." Yeah,
well, there are lots of early modern documents here, Wellcome, where the reading of the hand is connected to things like death by drowning, etc. So it seems
Incidentally, that's one of my favourite correlations in Richard Saunders' we looked at earlier. Is if you have a line, and he shows this line, of course, it is like a wavy line of the sea. Right. So that peril by water. Yes, crooked lines, basically crooked personality. So there's a lot of symbolism there as well. In the lines. A cross is not good either. That's a symbol. And death. There's one death by hanging. So yes, quite a lot of how you're going to end up.
And sometimes, so the metoposcopy can be combined with palmistry, which we've seen earlier.
Yes, and again, it's difficult to translate it from the German. So we did find it was quite awkward to translate. But I think things here often say a lot about the time as well, the sort of concerns of people. And again, we're talking about a kind of parlour game, a kind of fun thing you do at a party. But one of the ways Silbermann sold this was as a way to reveal, potential sweetheart's real character. So you're not going to get fooled by a pretty face, whereas actually they're not quite so nice,
We are coming back really to this practical value of physiognomics. So the ethical side, so are they choosing friends, avoiding enemies, or like in this case, finding a match, in a sense.
Someone who is, I suppose, yes, true, and not presenting a different version of themselves, which makes me think of something I read. Sorry, this is very modern, but it strikes me that there is still a lot of cultural inheritance about physiognomics. So the Prime Minister was criticised by a very close aide who said, who knew him, so Dominic Cummings talked about, and it's reported in the press as he's happy to, he said he was dishonest basically, but he said he's happy to present the mask of a clown so that people don't quite know what's going on underneath, and I think that's a really interesting a modern take on very
Cummings, the physiognomist.
But we all do. I think even there's been studies on politicians and how their physiognomy is and how people might relate to that, and how trustworthy gestures and trustworthy body language and rhetoric and looks influence people without them being too conscious of it.
And there is this, the big claim of physiognomics is really to help people get to the truth, isn't it? So in a sense, I mean, despite we've also seen the darker sides of physiognomics connected with racism, prejudicial profiling of all sorts, and at the same time we see this claim really from antiquity onwards. So the physiognomists will help you to see the truth beyond the lies. So it's an essential tool, when you deal with politicians.
I think for me, one of the revelations about how specific it is to particular periods in time and political ideologies are the Victorian presentation of the Irish political scene, and this is going back to the really early days of the tension, and how the Irish man was portrayed in a very simian like fashion, going back to this kind of caricature. So it was a political tool, and it was denigrating a whole sort of nation, but using the sort of the idea of physiognomy, and people would need to recognise the physiognomics of it in order to get the what it's saying.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's been wonderful and really a unique opportunity to see all these various layers of this very intricate history of physiognomics, which is very often, I think, portrayed as just being what it later became, and which we've also explored a bit, but we've seen the ramifications that really go into from politics to aesthetics to medicine to photography, and hopefully it will also help us with the current political situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I didn't know. I didn't notice that about coming.
Sorry.